The 20th of July 1969. Apollo 11 blasts off for a manned moon mission. Millions of television viewers all over the world follow the events on their screens. Neil Armstrong becomes the first human to set foot on the moon's surface. He says, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." One of the most ambitious projects ever staged by man comes to a successful conclusion. The United States of America finally wins the space race. This is certainly more than just a scientific success story during the era of the Cold War. The entire Apollo program was designed to demonstrate America's superiority in the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles as strategic weapons to the ideological opponents in the East. The moon landing, mankind's greatest achievement, had its roots in a small fishing village situated on the northerly coast of an island called Usedom, Peenemunde. It was here that the Nazis set up Hitler's secret weapon plant in great secrecy. It's generally accepted that this was the cradle of all space travel, but the mythos surrounding it all is closely tied to death and destruction. The 3rd of October 1942, the first successful flight of a rocket called Aggregate 4, which was later renamed the V2 by Nazi propaganda officials. The rocket flies a distance of 147 kilometers and is the first vehicle built by man that manages to fly up through the atmosphere to the borders of space. Although the development work taking place in Peenemunde is strictly for military purposes, research scientist Werner von Braun is already dreaming of a successful landing on the moon. It was simply a team of scientists working on the idea of flying to the moon, and that was the whole idea. We often went sailing together. It was possibly the month before the big attack on Peenemunde. That means the end of July 1943. It was wonderful sailing weather, the famous northeasterly wind you get on the Baltic Sea. We wanted to sail to a small island called Oya, which lies off Usedom, but the wind slowly died away. It was a day when it remained light until a very late hour. There was a full moon. Werner von Braun said, "We've got to go there." I said, "With this wind, we won't get to the island of Oya." Then he said, "No, not the island, I mean the moon." My reply was, "It's all a question of time and money." His reply was, "What do you estimate it will cost, and how long would one need?" We then began to do our sums for a simplified model. I wanted to know, should it be manned or unmanned flight to the moon? His answer was manned. And how many? 2. I said, they have to be able to come back down. Von Braun said 3 tons. My next question was, if the Aggregate 4 is the only rocket available, how big can the payload be? At the moment it's 7%, but we can get it up to 10 or 12%. We continued to do our sums, and then I told him my thoughts. We should use a hydrochloric acid propulsion unit while the specific thrust is less, but the specific weight is more and produces more performance than an oxygen unit. Oxygen should be used for the 2nd and 3rd stages. We produce figures that differed only slightly from what took place later. Werner von Braun was fascinated by the idea of space travel even as a child. The basis for German rocket research goes back to a book published in 1923 by a physicist by the name of Hermann Oberth. His publication unleashed a wave of interest in rocket technology. The weight relationship between a fully laden rocket and an empty one was something he termed the mass relationship. Using this and the jet velocity, he worked out his famous rocket equation. A large number of rocket enthusiasts then began to construct their own models. It wasn't long before the military began to take an interest in the new technology. Germany was not allowed to set up a new air force by the dictates of the Versailles Agreement. There was a loophole in the agreement where rockets were concerned. In 1929, the authorities were given permission to start research into liquid propulsion rockets. It was in 1930 that an engineer by the name of Walter Dornberger began to take up contact with various inventors and summarize the details of private research for the military authorities. At the end of the First World War, the German military leaders were forbidden to construct artillery pieces with a range of more than 35 kilometers. And 35 kilometers presented serious limitations. Thought was put into extending this range. Walter Dornberger got the idea of gathering all the rocket enthusiasts of the time together, who were working on rockets in Lichterfelder in Berlin, in Johannisthal or anywhere else, and were continually asking for funds, and finally create some order in the entire research and experiments.
Die doch mal zusammenzuholen und etwas Systematik in die ganze Entwicklung und Versuche hereinzubekommen.
It was on the 27th of September 1930 that Rudolf Nebel and Klaus Riedel opened a private rocket test ground in Rhein-Eckendorf in Berlin with secret financial support from the military. A short while later, they were joined by a student of physics by the name of Werner von Braun. Rudolf Nebel staged an unsuccessful rocket demonstration on the 22nd of June 1932, which prompted the authorities to set up their own research under Walter Dornberger. Werner von Braun took the initiative and asked for a meeting with Colonel Becker to offer his services. The net result was an offer to cooperate. Von Braun, driven by faith in his dreams, fell into the clutches of the military authorities. He was later to say that only the financial support and the test areas controlled by the chiefs of staff presented a practical start towards the goal of space travel. In Germany, the National Socialists seize power. Rearmament is secretly pushed forward and rocket technology plays a key part. The aim is to use it to produce new long-range weapons. This is done in absolute secrecy. Popular articles about rockets suddenly disappeared from newspapers and other publications. The first test with rocket propulsion units and the development of the aggregate A1 took place in Kummersdorf in 1933. The further development of the aggregate A2 with 300 kilograms thrust takes place and successful testing is done in Bochum in December 1934. The German rockets gain more range. But flight testing can no longer be carried out over densely populated Berlin. In the meantime, the aggregate A3 is capable of 1.5 tons of thrust. On the 16th of March 1935, Hitler announces Germany's intention of no longer complying with armaments restrictions laid down in the Versailles Agreement. General conscription is reintroduced. In the same year, the Army Weapons Department agrees to joint development of rocket-driven fighter aircraft together with the Luftwaffe. Following a tour of the rocket establishment in Kummersdorf, the military chiefs of staff agree to finance a new test establishment. Werner von Braun comes across Peenemunde in his search for a suitable location. Construction work begins in August 1936. The first workshops are completed in May 1937. Werner von Braun is appointed the technical director in the military development establishment known as the East Works. The first housing on a residential estate called Karlshagen can be occupied in July 1937. 4 test flights of the A3 are staged on a little island called Greifswalder Oyer, northeast of Peenemunde, from the 4th to the 11th of December 1937. They were not successful due to control problems. Administrative organization between the Army Weapons Department and the Luftwaffe Research Establishment is officially separated on the 1st of April 1938. A test series with A5 rockets is carried out in summer. Ranges of up to 18 kilometers and up to 12 kilometers height are achieved. At the same time, the first rocket-driven aircraft in the world, the Heinkel HE-176, is flown in Peenemunde. Later, the Me-163 rocket-driven fighter undergoes testing and becomes the first fighter of its kind to go into series production. The Aggregate 4 is still in the test stages, but an order was given to construct facilities for series production on the 21st of November 1938. Planning work for the South Works starts in January 1938. The restricted area on the island of Usedom is expanded to include Sempin and Wolgast.
Die Kontrolle fing also in Zinnowitz schon an.
The first control point was in Zinnowitz. Then came 14 miles of works railway line to the works itself. There was a main control point here and lots of fences.
Zum Beispiel musste man eine Plakette.
You had to wear a badge when working. They were issued in various colors and designs. Each section of the works had its own badge.
In verschiedenen Ausführungen. Und die hatten alle, jede Plakette hatte ihren Bereich.
Diese ganze Anlage war...
The whole area was a restricted zone. Even access to the island via the bridge in Wolgast was strictly controlled.
Hitler war nie in Peenemunde.
Hitler never did visit Peenemunde. This all belonged to the top-secret status in the beginning. High-ranking visitors were kept away on purpose in the initial stages. Neither Goering, Hitler, nor Himmler visited Peenemunde up to the time of the large-scale air attack on the area. If they wanted to inform themselves about the latest developments in rocket research, then they simply visited the Army Weapons Department in Kummersdorf.
Informieren wollten, kamen sie nach Kummersdorf zum Heereswaffenamt, dem dortigen Übungsgelände, und haben sich dort informieren lassen. Man hat gewusst, dass Kummersdorf bekannt ist.
This was nothing special for foreign intelligence sources, who were used to high-ranking personalities there. Peenemunde managed to retain this up until the first air attacks. When we went to work, we had to have our identity cards with us, and they were issued in various colors. Apart from that, we could move around freely. We were not allowed to talk about our work because of secrecy restrictions, which operated at 3 different levels. Apart from that, we could go home or travel on holiday. We had absolutely no restrictions. No one listening in to telephone conversations or the like. We knew quite well how we had to behave, and that was the main thing. The R-4 was to be put into service as a long-range ballistic missile. 975 kilograms of explosive and the detonator equipment were carried in the nose. The next compartment contained the gyros and control system, as well as devices for the navigational beam, velocity and burn control radio receivers, and a velocity radio transmitter. The main part of the rocket was made up of the 2 main tanks containing a mixture of alcohol and water, the B fuel, and the liquid oxygen known as the A fuel. The fuels were transported to the centrifugal pumps by means of piping. The tail of the craft consisted of control surfaces constructed in the form of a cross. Graphite rudders are fitted in the exhaust stream. The alcohol fuel was forced into the combustion chamber via 8 injectors. Oxygen was also fed in. The high-pressure pumps were steam-driven, and this was created by hydrogen superoxide and potassium permanganate, known as the T and Z substances. The oxygen and alcohol were mixed in the combustion chamber and burnt at a temperature of 2,700 degrees Celsius. This unit produced 25.4 tons of thrust. The aerodynamic rudders on the control surfaces, together with the graphite rudders in the propulsion exhaust, kept the missile on a stable course. Flight control commands were passed on to the rudders via servo motors. The exact flight distance was controlled by the speed and duration of the motor burn. The rocket unit was switched off once the missile had reached its terminal velocity. From this point onwards, the missile flew ballistically at a speed of 5,500 kilometers per hour. The 1st of September 1939, Hitler's Wehrmacht moves into Poland. The beginning of the Second World War gives Peenemunde a special status. The Army Supreme Commander, von Braun, orders the A4 to be ready for series production by 1941. The first testing of the Aggregate 4 propulsion unit takes place on the 21st of March 1940 and produces 25 tons of thrust. The 1st of May 1940, Albert Speer, who was later to become Hitler's armament minister, takes over construction work at Peenemunde. The war begins to expand. On the 10th of May 1940, German troops occupy northern France and the Atlantic coastal regions. It's from here that flying bombs and rockets will eventually be launched against England. On the 29th of July 1940, the first steps in planning to produce a two-stage intercontinental rocket which can reach New York are carried out in Peenemunde. The so-called Aggregate 9/10 with its two stages is designed to be taken to a height of 190 kilometers by the A-10 starter rocket before separation takes place. Then the Aggregate 9 is designed to cover 5,500 kilometers in approximately 35 minutes. A variation in the propulsion unit planning centered on 6 propulsion units mounted together with each producing 30 tons of thrust. Incidentally, this idea was later used in the Saturn rockets, which flew with 5 propulsion units. One planned version of the A9 also included a cockpit with a pressurization system which hinted at a possible civilian use of the rocket. A further development was the A11, which could create enormous thrust of around 1,700 tons and could carry the A9/10 combination. This could have made manned spaceflight possible. These studies eventually laid the basis for the American Saturn rockets and the Russian Vostok rockets. But before the dream of intercontinental rockets could be realized, success had to be gained in other fields. The Aggregate 4 wasn't even in the testing stage. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union begins on the 22nd of June 1941. Hitler reveals his main ambition, to destroy his ideological opponents to the east. The war soon proves to be harder and more inhumane than any other. Hitler's racial policies will eventually bring death to millions of people. The Germans remain optimistic that victory will be theirs, although the Nazi blitzkrieg strategy wasn't so successful in Russia. The 20th of August 1941 sees Walter Dornberger give a briefing to Hitler on developments taking place in Peenemunde. The Nazi leader allocates the highest possible priority to the research work being done by Dornberger and von Braun. Hitler wants large numbers to be produced. The actual production should take place in external production facility. On the 29th of October 1941, the Peenemunde experts prepare plans for the development of a new anti-aircraft missile. Later, on the 18th of September 1942, the German Army and Luftwaffe agree on joint development of an anti-aircraft missile, which is later further developed in 1943 under the name of C-2 or Waterfall. But the first test start of the Waterfall missile only takes place in Peenemunde on the 29th of February 1944. This weapon is actually a much smaller version of the A4. Because the carousel infrared target mechanism fails to be ready on time, and because the ground-to-air missile is too expensive, the experts develop a cheap version called the Typhoon in 1944. This weapon is designed to be fired in salvos. The Butterfly remote-controlled anti-aircraft missile, the HS-117, is even able to fly a curve almost up to 360 degrees. Another remote-controlled anti-aircraft missile called Enzian is also developed in sub- and supersonic version. The Enzian E5 was later to become the basis for the NATO Hawk missile.
Und da hat's dann auch nachher,
And then, later on, when everything was ready, there was more disagreement about whether the armed forces should use the weapon or not. Whether fighters should be used to counter enemy aircraft.
Lange die These, die feindlichen Flugzeuge bekämpfen unsere Jäger. Das war
the German Aviation Ministry clung to this point of view for a long period.
Vorstellung der entsprechenden Leute gewesen. Und die Durchsetzung.
It took a long time to force the idea of anti-aircraft rockets through. When it was finally achieved, it was all too late.
Nachher zu spät.
It was in November 1941 that Army Command began to cover the growing personnel deficit of the Northern Research Command establishment. Technicians taken from Army units were sent to Peenemunde on the basis of their suitability according to their civilian occupations.
Man hat also Fachleute.
They took specialists from differing fields from the units. Engineers with degrees and others. It was all rather grotesque. For instance, there was Dr. Someone or other who was a corporal, and another technical draftsman who was a sergeant major. They worked in the drawing offices and laboratories, but military rules had to be observed outside. But it all worked. I didn't hear about any difficulties. On the 25th of February 1942, the first test version of the A4 is put on test on stand number 7, but the rocket is destroyed during firing tests. Werner von Braun is disappointed after all the setbacks, but he still has the ability to motivate his colleagues.
I
will never forget what happened when a start failed and he came back from test stand 7. He was so depressed. He had various expressions to show his feelings because he couldn't understand it. Sometimes it could be proven to be a material fault or even sabotage. Von Braun was a young scientist, and I came from industry where we had few academics. These were people with completely different structures, who could infuse people with their enthusiasm. Where I came from, you did your work without much enthusiasm. I remember him well. blue eyes, blonde, and always a smile on his face. He was a good-looking fellow, no doubt about that.
Sah schon gut aus, ohne Zweifel.
Der Braun war ein überaus sympathischer.
Von Braun was very likable. There was no dark side to him.
Kein Dünkel und gar nichts. Hat sich auch noch später nach Jahren
10 years after the end of the war, I wrote and asked him for a reference, which he answered in a very nice way.
geantwortet und so weiter. Nach 10 Jahren nach
He was a kind
Nein,
person.
menschlich war er hervorragend.
Das Flugbuch von Werner von Braun zu
My
führen.
job was to keep Werner von Braun's flight log up to date. I was often in his outer office.
Also dort, ich bin dort außen eingegangen im Vorzimmer. Man konnte mit ihm
He was a good type.
Pferde stehlen. Ja, also das war schon. Und ich bin auch noch, dann kam später.
Then his brother Magnus von Braun, a sergeant major, was posted to Peenemunde, and I also flew with him on many occasions.
Mit dem bin ich auch noch viel geflogen.
The gyro control systems on the A4 were modified to improve the flight path. The rudders in the exhaust stream were designed to counter drift due to side winds. The technicians worked furiously on the problem.
Wenn nun dieses System, nehmen Sie das,
You could compare the system to a beer bottle.
Bierflasche. Ja. Ne?
The rocket, a beer bottle in this case, stands there and the start begins.
Ne? Und jetzt wird die gestartet.
Thrust is generated
Und der Schub,
and up it
die Wolle
goes.
hebt die ab. Ne? Und die greift,
If it starts to fall one way or another, the gyros give a command to counter this with rudder movement.
Strahlruder und dann drückt es so, das ist
It's like balancing a broom handle on one finger.
Finger jonglieren so, ne? So müssen Sie sich das vorstellen. Ne? Und das Ganze
The whole system is all right
alles in
until you have a
Ordnung.
wind problem.
Nur, wenn jetzt durch Wind das
When the
ganze
wind
System
wants to blow the whole system away, the gyroscopes can't help. This is why the guide beam and plane of flight reference were introduced.
Leitstrahl. Deswegen in die Leitebene.
The first successful start came on the 3rd of October 1942. As Colonel Walter Dornberger said during a small celebration later on in the evening, "We have reached out to space with our rockets, and for the first time we've used space as a bridge between 2 points on the Earth. We've now proved that rocket propulsion units are suitable for space travel." This, the 3rd of October 1942, is the first day of a new era in transport technology. It's the beginning of spaceship travel. From the many developments that took place in Peenemunde that were before their times, it's worth mentioning the remote-controlled HS-293 glider bomb. It was released from a carrier aircraft at a distance of 18 miles and was able to hit a target 4 meters by 4 meters exactly.
Die hatte ein Gewicht von 900.
The weapon weighed 980 kilograms plus or minus 15 kilograms. The wingspan was 3.12 meters and its length tended to differ according to its equipment. The first ones were longer and had weights for trimming in the nose. Later models didn't have this. Then the weights were put in the tail. A number of modifications were made, for example the television camera bomb. The camera was mounted on the nose so the carrier plane pilot who dropped the weapon in the first place could monitor the bomb's flight.
Die Entwicklung der HS-293, die lief eigentlich schon darauf hinaus aus dem sogenannten Spanienkrieg.
The development of the HS-293 was based on experience gathered during the Spanish Civil War, when pilots found it was difficult to hit targets exactly with normal bombs. The idea here was to have a bomb that could hit a target exactly. The HS-293 was released about 18 kilometers from the target, which meant the carrier plane did not have to fly through anti-aircraft fire. Exact control was done with equipment mounted in the cockpit. The bomb's course was followed visually and was remote controlled. 5 magnesium flares were mounted on the tail of the bomb, which helped the crew to hit the target.
Nach Sicht. Das heißt also, am Heck dieser Bombe waren Leuchtraketen dran, das waren 5 Magnesiumfackel, die waren bei tagsüber dran, und dieses Magnesiumlicht zielte jetzt dieser Bombenschütze auf das Jetzt zog er auf den Punkt drauf, wo es hinfliegen sollte.
This is the aerial from there to there. This is the aerial adapter, and at this point the bomb was supplied with heated air from the Dornier 217 or another carrier aircraft. Yes, the bomb was preheated during its flight.
Während des Fluges wurde die vorgeheizt noch. Da gingen die Warmluft von den Motoren, von der Do-217 oder Trägerflugzeug, ging hier rein, damit die Wärme reinkam.
These are the flares. You can see something red up here. This was designed for nighttime conditions. It was a 250-watt red bulb, because the flares tended to dazzle at night. That was all you could see in the darkness.
Da nachts waren die Fackeln nicht zu sehen, sondern da war nur dieses rote Licht zu sehen. Das war rubinrotes Glas hier oben drin.
This is the self-destruction device, which was connected via a hook to the carrier plane. Now the hook ripped off on release and meant that the receiver and other secret equipment were destroyed, regardless of where the weapon landed.
Und die ganzen geheimen Dinge davon nochmal zerstört wurden.
This was used to tune in to the correct channel for the carrier aircraft. We had 18 channels, which meant 18 planes could fly on a bombing operation at one time. There was no radio interference. And all this at a distance of 18 kilometers from the target. The Americans still can't do this exactly, even today. The Fritz X bomb was even easier to operate for many bomb aimers than the remote-controlled HS-293. The bomb fell in the direction of the target without any propulsion unit. Bomb aimers had 30 seconds from the time the bomb left the bomb bay to modify their aim. Weather was, however, a problem. Cloud cover meant the target, maybe a ship or a bridge, was difficult to see.
Zum Beispiel war diese nachgelenkte Fallbombe Fritz X.
The Fritz X bomb was steerable. It could be released with special equipment or as a normal bomb from a height of 6,000 to 8,000 meters.
Aus etwa 6.000 bis 8.000 Meter abgeworfen wurde.
The weapon was designed to destroy special armor-plated targets at sea in the main.
Seeziele hauptsächlich zu zerstören.
The most spectacular success of the Fritz X weapon was the sinking of the Roma, a fairly modern Italian battleship, on the 9th of September 1943. It was with the Italian fleet on their way to La Spezia to join forces with the wartime allies.
Wir sind auf Punktziele, also Punktzielangriffe, sind wir damit übergegangen.
We changed over to precision bombing.
Fall, was die Fernlenkkörper betrifft, speziell HS-293. Und
we used the HS-293 and the Fritz X to achieve this.
Versucht in die Tat umzusetzen.
At the beginning of June 1942, the Fiesler Works began the construction of a flying bomb. The development of this project, known as the FI-103, which was later renamed the V-1, only took 6 months. Christmas Eve 1942 saw the start of testing in Peenemunde. A V-1 only cost 3,500 Reichsmarks, which was about a tenth of the cost of a V-2. The way a V-1 functioned was relatively simple. The exact distance to the target was set on a counter. A propeller on the nose measured the distance flown. Once the target was reached, say the centre of London, the mechanism shut the motor down and set the elevator to dive. The start was complicated because a 55-metre-long tilted ramp was needed as a catapult. A steam-driven piston was used to accelerate the craft up to an initial speed of 320 kilometers per hour. Then the pulse jet engine cut in. The V-1 needed 22 minutes at a speed of 600 to 650 kilometers per hour to reach London. The accuracy was give or take 15 kilometers. Military targets, which German dive bombers normally attacked, could not be destroyed using the V-1. Later, hundreds of V-1 ramps were erected along the Channel coast. Although they were camouflaged, Allied aircraft could discover them. Later, transportable ramps were developed. At the beginning of April 1943, the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, visits Peenemunde and sees a demonstration by an A4. 2 A4s make a start. Although one makes an unscheduled landing and demolishes 3 aircraft, Himmler remains impressed by rocket technology.
Da ging ein Versuch fehl in die Hosen.
The test went wrong, and he slapped General Dornberger on the shoulder, saying, "Don't lose heart. It's not the first time that I've seen a demonstration of a weapon go wrong. Carry on as before."
Dem der Erfolg versagt geblieben ist. Machen Sie weiter und so fort.
Himmler and von Braun were standing together, and I was behind them. The first start went wrong, the second one as well, and the third start worked. Himmler slowly turned around and congratulated Herr von Braun. Ties between the SS and Peenemunde become closer as the SS gains ever more power and influence in Germany. Dornberger hopes that Himmler will be able to provide him with more influence on Hitler. Werner von Braun has been a member of the SS since the 1st of May 1940, possibly due more to opportunism than conviction. He couldn't withstand the pressure being put on him. But Werner von Braun seldom wore his uniform. Most photographs show him wearing civilian clothes. Comparison testing between the A4 and the Fi-103 flying bomb on the 26th of May 1943 clearly showed that the A4 was superior. But the decision was taken to put both weapons into series production. The Army Research Department requested concentration camp inmates as forced labor for the production, so the project could remain secret. This tends to document Peenemunde's closer ties with the SS, which could supply the badly needed labor. German workers were nearly all on the front and weren't available. Only concentration camp prisoners and forced foreign labor were on hand to meet the demands of the armaments program. Prisoners of war were also located in Peenemunde. Kurt Bornträger, the Peenemunde Development Works adjutant, looks back.
Wir bekamen für die Küstenverteidigung
We were supplied with captured heavy Russian machine guns for coastal defense purposes. I got my prisoners of war to look after them, because there were a number of weapons officers among them. Then I took the guns and my prisoners for target practice on the coast. I did have a certain amount of trust in them, but I always had a cocked pistol ready to hand. Suddenly came the call for more people. We needed labor. Then someone had the idea to use Russian prisoners of war. Quite naturally not for secret matters, but for construction and the like. First I selected a lieutenant colonel as a camp elder, and then a Russian doctor, and even a musical director, because I was told the prisoners had to be able to do something, like singing. So it was all arranged, 300 men turned up, and were initially quartered in old barracks close to the Peene River.
Die Fremdarbeiter hatten, soweit wir das sehen konnten,
as far as we could see, the foreign workers did not have to work under discriminating and inhumane conditions.
Und irgendwie unmenschlichen Arbeitsbedingungen, überhaupt nicht.
Quite the opposite.
Die KZler, die dann nachher später, es war,
but the concentration camp inmates who were sent to Peenemunde West in 1942 naturally had to endure concentration camp conditions.
Die hatten natürlich die entsprechenden Bedingungen eines KZs zu ertragen. Und die Kapos, die also die Züge,
the capos, prisoners in charge of work details, etc., who monitored the trains coming into Peenemunde, inflicted hard discipline on the men, and that was clear to see.
Und hartes Regiment. Das war durchaus zu sehen. Aber Es war auch so,
But the camp inmates also worked in workshops and in the outer buildings of the various technical groups in the W21 administrative
der
building.
einzelnen Fachgruppen in dem Verwaltungsgebäude W21 tätig, haben da Hauspost verteilt und herumgetragen.
They used to distribute the post.
Sie wurden auch bei
During air
Fliegerangriffen
raids, they were allowed
in den
into the
Hochbunker
main
mit
bunker.
hineingenommen. Nicht? Also, das
This
war
has also
auch
been documented.
festzuhalten.
They were
Die waren
not
also
left
nicht irgendwie
outside, but
draußen
enjoyed the
gelassen
security of the
worden,
bunker.
sondern die kamen auch den Schutz des Hochbunkers in Anspruch nehmen können, zu deren Verwirklichung sie ja letzten Endes auch in großem Maße beigetragen haben. Sie haben ja auch Fachkräfte.
Their ranks also
Bauer
included
gehabt,
specialists
in
and
ihren
bricklayers.
Reihen, und die haben dann auch bei der Erstellung
They
des
also helped to
Hochbunkers
construct the main bunker in Peenemunde West, which was not available during the first attack.
Dann beim zweiten Angriff nachher auch in wesentlicher Form mitgeholfen.
The 7th of July 1943 sees Dornberger and von Braun present a personal report to Hitler on the state of rocket development in Peenemunde. Hitler gives the A4 program top priority status. In the meantime, aerial reconnaissance experts have been evaluating the pictures of Peenemunde from the air and take the decision to destroy the secret weapon production sites. But factories and plant can be rebuilt, so the German scientists become the prime target of the Royal Air Force. British planes bombed Peenemunde during the night of the 17th to the 18th of August 1943. Some 750 people were killed, including 600 foreign laborers. The development plant suffers only slight damage.
War eine warme Vollmondnacht.
It was a warm night with a full moon.
Bedingungen.
Ideal conditions for an attack.
Dieser Angriff hat aber nur das Werk Ost getroffen. Wir im Werk West,
But the planes
wir
only
etwas,
hit the east works.
westlich lagen, deswegen auch der Begriff
We
Werk
at the
West,
west works to the
westlich
west
auf
of
den
Peenemunde were
Hang
spared.
lagen. Wir wurden also vollkommen verschont. Und im Fremdarbeiterlager hat der
There were
tödliche
a large number of deaths in the foreign labor camp and on the estate between Karlshagen and the west works.
Zwischen Karlshagen und dem Werk Süd von Werk Ost erstellt wurde.
Wir haben in Karlshagen gewohnt, in einem ledigen Heim.
We lived in a hostel for single women, House Viking in Karlshagen. It was wonderful with parquet floors, showers and a communal kitchen.
Und wir mussten inzwischen schon
We had to
mit einer
double up in the
Kollegin
accommodation
vorlieb nehmen.
because
Wir
of the
wohnten
demand
also
for
zu
labor in
zweit,
the
weil
works.
zu viel Kräfte gebraucht wurden im Werk.
We often had alarms
Ja,
and
gut, wir
weren't
haben schon öfter
unduly
Alarm,
worried.
haben uns ja gar nicht dran gestört, nicht?
But
Bis
when the
dann
curtains
der
fell
Rail
down
mit der
complete
Gardine
with the rails, I
runterflog
said,
und dann
"Hilda,
sagte Hilde,
we have
komm,
to get
wir
out
müssen
of here."
raus. Und dann waren wir fast die Letzten,
We were
die in den
almost the last
Luftraum
people to
kamen.
reach
Das
the
heißt,
bunker.
wir kamen gar nicht mehr in den Luftraum.
Actually, we didn't get
Wir
inside,
blieben
but
in der
found
offenen
shelter in the
Tür
doorway.
hängen. Ja. Und dadurch
This is
haben
why we
wir
were
alles
showered with dirt from the
mitbekommen,
bomb
der
explosions.
durch die Bomben
It
verteilt
was
wurde
awful.
vom Sand und von den Tannennadeln. Also es war
And
ganz
when it was all
schlimm.
over,
Ganz
the incendiary
schlimm.
bombs set the shutters on
Und als
fire
dann alles
and the wind
vorbei
began to
war,
spread the
dann waren
flames.
die Phosphorbomben, die
We went into the house, but it was too dangerous.
Holzläden, die man an den Fenstern hatte, und der Wind trieb das Feuer rein.
We wanted to fight the
Der Wind
fire,
ins
but there was
Haus
nothing to
rein,
do it
aber
with.
das
We
war
had
zu
to get out
gefährlich. Da
again.
mussten wir wieder raus. Wir wollten ja am liebsten löschen,
It was
aber
all a
da war
shock
keine
for us,
Möglichkeit mehr.
but we
Der
hadn't
Sturm, der war
recognized
so
it at the
schlimm.
time.
Ja, und dann
It was difficult to
hat
remember
man
what
praktisch,
exactly
ohne dass man
happened.
es weiter einen Schock
My
bekommen,
girlfriend
dann weiß man
Christa
gar nicht
told
mehr
me
genau,
everything
was
later.
dann gewesen ist. Und das hat mir dann meine Freundin Christa erzählt. Wir wurden irgendwann auf einen Lastwagen
We were later
geladen
loaded
und
onto a
dann
lorry
fuhren
and taken to
irgendwo
some
in eine
communal
Unterkunft,
accommodation,
eine
but
Gemeinschaftsunterkunft.
I can't remember all that
Daran
because I
kann
was
ich
in
mich auch nicht
shock.
entsinnen. Da habe ich einen regelrechten Schock erlitten.
The bomb craters were not filled in later, and the houses were not rebuilt in an effort to confuse the Allies. Research went on. Then came the decision to move rocket production to an underground factory in Kornstein near Nordhausen in Thuringia. On the 28th of August 1943, inmates from Buchenwald concentration camp begin the tunneling work for the huge central works. Thousands of concentration camp workers lose their lives under conditions of the worst kind. The assembly line production of the V-2 weapons begins in the early part of 1944 in a system of underground corridors and tunnels, following the successful Waffen-SS testing at the Heidelager troop maneuver area near Blitzna in southern Poland. Around 900 V-2s leave the works every month. At the same time, preparations are underway to set up launch sites in occupied France. From October 1943 onwards, the TOT organization, responsible for all large-scale construction in the Third Reich, works on a massive underground complex in Elfaux-Viserne near Saint-Omer. The plan is to store the V-2s here and launch them at London, about 200 kilometers away. The huge Eder railway tunnel is to be used for trains delivering rockets from Germany. Using forced foreign labor and prisoners of war, the authorities push ahead with the construction of more than 7 kilometers of tunnels in the chalk plateau. Caves lined with concrete are used for fuel storage, liquid oxygen, electrical generators, and accommodation for the garrison. The Germans construct a huge concrete dome with a radius of 71 meters to protect the tunnels. This 55,000-ton concrete roof was later able to withstand the force of 3,000 Allied bombs. But no rocket was ever to be launched from here. Hitler decides to halt construction work on the 28th of July 1944 as the fighting on the front got closer. The concrete dome has survived up to the present day. La Coupole now houses a museum. The first massive attacks on England using the flying bombs launched from the Western Front came about 1 week after the Allied landings in Normandy, D-Day, on the 15th of June 1944. The German propaganda people described the V-1 as a revenge weapon for the bombing raids on German cities. The required reaction took place. The indiscriminate explosions caused by the flying bombs instilled fear in the hearts of the general public. The losses were not particularly high, but the effect was. The anti-aircraft sites on the Channel coast began to shoot down the slow-moving flying bombs. The British set up a ring of balloons around London, and between the balloons and the anti-aircraft fire there were the fighters operating from the south coast. The British defence begins to take effect. From the 100 V-1s fired on one day, fewer than 25% reach their target. The V-1 offensive against London comes to an end on the 1st of September 1944. A total of 6,000 people lost their lives. Then the operational use of the 5,500 kilometers per hour A4 rocket is forced ahead. This couldn't be shot down by the enemy. The first A4 operation against London, Paris and Antwerp is staged on the 7th of September 1944 from mobile launch facilities on the Western Front. Once launched, nothing could stop a V-2. The actual military impact was limited. A maximum of 30 tons of bombs were delivered in this way daily, while the Allies were dropping 3,000 tons of bombs from the air daily on German cities. All told, 2,400 V-1s and 3,200 V-2s are launched against targets during the Second World War. 8,938 people in England and 6,500 people in Belgium lose their lives. The production of 5,789 rockets in underground facilities cost the lives of 25,000 prisoners from the Dora camp directly or indirectly. It's a shocking balance of weapons that cost more lives during their production than their use against the enemy caused. In July and August 1944, Peenemunde comes under considerable attack from the US Air Force. Suggestions to move the rocket research facilities to a place called Ebensee in the Austrian Alps are finally abandoned after a number of delays. The SS grabs even more power than the military leadership in Germany following the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate Hitler on the 20th of July 1944. This too has its effects in Peenemunde. On the 8th of August, SS Brigade Commander Hans Kammler takes over preparations for the operational readiness of the A4V2 weapons as a special representative of Heinrich Himmler. There always was a lot of speculation about how decisive the so-called wonder weapons might have been for the outcome of the war. The hostilities may have taken a different turn had the rocket and pulse jet weapons been put into service sooner and in larger numbers. Even high-ranking Allied officers admit the Normandy landings would not have been possible had the V2 been used 6 months earlier.
Die Flächenbekämpfungswaffen kamen einmal zu spät.
On the one hand, these weapons came too late. And on the other, there weren't enough of them.
In zu geringem Maße zur Anwendung.
Es war eine außerordentlich langwierige Entwicklung.
It was an extremely long and difficult development process. Testing was complicated, and even at the end of the war, the weapons had not been developed to the stage where they could have been used on a massive scale.
Dass es für einen Masseneinsatz in Frage gekommen wäre. Zu spät.
The second point is these weapons could not be used to hit targets precisely, but rather only areas.
Werden konnten, sondern nur Flächenziele. Das heißt also, die Treffgenauigkeit war
The accuracy was so bad that decisive targets in the war could not be destroyed by them.
entscheidende Ziele nicht
Only by
getroffen
chance.
werden können, es sei denn durch Zufall. Und der dritte Gesichtspunkt ist der,
The third point is that a new turn of events or a change would only have extended the duration of the war.
Wende hätte eingesetzt werden können, realisiert werden können, dann wäre das Kriegsende nur hinausgezögert worden und möglicherweise
It's possible that an atomic weapon might have been dropped on Germany.
Folge gehabt.
Could the earlier operational use of the waterfall anti-aircraft rockets have countered or limited the massive air attacks on Germany in which hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their lives? Could the secret weapons have been decisive? The insistence of Armaments Minister Albert Speer that the new weapons could change the luck of the war motivated some of the high-ranking officers who were already resigned to defeat to use their last efforts to get the wonder weapons operational. Would this have meant the end of the war? Could a realistic estimation of the situation have saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who died in the last months of the hostilities? Towards the end of the war, the planning group in Peenemunde concentrate on building an A4 with wings. Following the Normandy landings, launching weapons from the French coast had become impossible. The answer was to extend the range of the A4. The idea was to use the wings to create a non-powered glide when the vehicle re-entered the denser layers of air. But tests with the A4 ended in failure in January 1945. A 750-kilometer range was out of the question, and the project was shelved. Even another ambitious project involving rockets being launched by German submarines off New York failed to materialize, even though tests with underwater rockets had been carried out as early as June 1942. The life jacket project involved an A4 in a pressure-proof container which could be towed to the target by a submarine. Then the stern could be flooded and the container could take up a vertical position. A gyro-stabilized platform was to be used to fuel up the A4 and enable the launching. A document was compiled in the middle of December 1944 which stipulated that initial testing should be completed by the end of March 1945. But things never got that far. It would have been chaotic in New York when the rocket landed. Where had it come from? People would have thought it had been launched in Germany. The Reichenberg unit, which was a manned V-1, also failed to get into operation. Hitler had only passed this suicide project much against his will. Hannah Reich, a famous German woman pilot, also flew this model as a test pilot and was one of the main supporters of the idea. She saw it as a chance to end the war quickly. A small number of volunteers could stop the Allied bombing, which was killing thousands on the front and in large cities. Hannah Reich felt it could strengthen the German position during peace negotiations. The Russian front begins to get closer and closer. It was on the 31st of January 1945 that the SS officer responsible for the rocket project ordered the evacuation of Peenemunde to Bleicherode in the Harz Mountains. The evacuation began on the 17th of February. Everything that couldn't be transported was destroyed. Von Braun managed to smuggle the majority of important technical documents to a disused mine in the Harz area. He hoped this would be a help in negotiating with the Americans. He felt the United States was the only Allied power worthy of taking over the legacy left behind by the Peenemunde establishment. The situation got even more critical in March, and Hans Kammler ordered the 500 Peenemunde people to be evacuated to the Alps on the 1st of April 1945. Von Braun, together with Dornberger and his brother Magnus, find accommodation in the Ingeborg house in Oberjoch. Kammler suddenly disappears without trace, and the control by the SS is eased. Werner von Braun decides to take up contact with the Americans. It was on the 2nd of May 1945, shortly after the death of Hitler had been reported on the radio, that Magnus von Braun offered the capitulation of the Peenemunde people. Von Braun and his scientists underwent weeks of interrogation by the Americans, but soon a climate of mutual respect grows up between the victors and the losers. It was this that enabled the secrets of the Peenemunde rocket research to be passed on almost in their entirety. Between 8 and 10 men came in slouch hats and leather coats. They looked like Gestapo. What's this? They're Germans. You speak German, so go over to them. So I went over and introduced myself. Naturally, they were scared stiff because they didn't know who I was. Then an American officer appeared and they introduced themselves. In any case, they were very shy and didn't say much. 2 days later, the phone rang and I was told to contact Major Somerville. So I went along. The doors and windows were shut. What do you think of the Germans? So, I'm of German descent. Would you like to work with the Germans? I said, I wouldn't have anything against it. It didn't take long. 2 days later, I got a new post to a place which had the entire Peenemunde archives and other paperwork.
Die hatten die ganzen Peenemunde Archive und noch andere.
It was about 90 tons of paper in all.
Und
I became the head of the translation department for the Peenemunde archives.
Übersetzungsabteilung für die Peenemunde Archive. Und die Sache war die,
the German scientists were all in Fort Bliss in El Paso in Texas, but we didn't want to bring the paperwork together with the people who were still technically our enemies, because things could be destroyed or disappear.
dass sie vielleicht die Unterlagen vernichten könnten oder irgendwie verschwinden lassen könnten.
As a result, we always had people working on various construction sections who were taken to Aberdeen from Fort Bliss.
Nach Aberdeen gebracht.
When the work was done, they returned to El Paso, and the next group turned up in Aberdeen.
Ging die wieder zurück nach El Paso und dann die nächste Baugruppe kam nach.
It was all very interesting, but we didn't have much idea because the Germans were 10 or 15 years ahead of us in rocket research. The enormous transfer of technology within the framework of Operation Paperclip gave the Americans a huge advantage in rocket and jet propulsion technology. Cautious American estimates say Washington managed to save about $2 billion by utilizing the know-how. The central team of 115 Peenemunde scientists was secretly taken to the United States, where they continued rocket research in great secrecy under the leadership of Werner von Braun. On the 16th of April 1946, the first V-2 captured by the Americans is launched from White Sands, a test range lying north of El Paso. A total of 70 starts took place up to 1952. Then research began to lose momentum because President Truman slashed military expenditure dramatically and put more emphasis on atomic long-range bombers than on missiles. The outbreak of the Korean War changes the situation. The rocket program was reactivated. Just like in the 1930s, Werner von Braun began to profit from rearmament. Cape Canaveral, just like Peenemunde, lay directly at the seaside, and this became the new rocket research center. Years later, von Braun realized his dream of sending a rocket to the moon in a civilian space program. But let's turn back to Peenemunde and the final days of the Second World War. The 19th Soviet Army rolls into Peenemunde on the 4th of May 1945. It takes quite some time before the Russians actually recognize the importance of Peenemunde and dismantle the plants. May 1945 sees a German technical office set up in Peenemunde with German staff headed by Soviet officers. Everything worthwhile is dismantled by the Soviets right up to 1948. At the end, explosive teams destroy all the buildings, bunkers and test stands. Some 5,000 German experts begin work producing V-2 rockets for the Soviets in the central works in North Thuringia. In 1948, Moscow stations a fighter squadron in Peenemunde, and it also becomes a naval base in the newly founded communist East Germany. The naval forces belonging to the National People's Army included coastal protection vessels, mine layers, and mine clearance ships. The northwest part of the island of Usedom is once again a restricted area where Warsaw Pact troops later stage countless maneuvers. These days, a small missile ship, the Tarantul 1, and the U-461, a Russian cruise missile launching submarine, are in the harbour. These relics from the Cold War can be visited by the general public. The end of the 1950s sees the Russian Air Force withdraw from the area. The Heinrich Rau, or No. 9 Squadron, is relocated from Drewitz to Peenemunde. At the start of the 1970s, the East Germans build bunkers to protect their military jets. Today, one can view the old NVA planes, including the famous MiG fighters. There's not much left to see of the old Army Weapons Department or the Luftwaffe testing establishment. The best exhibition in the historic Technical Information Center can be visited in the bunker. A full-size model of the Aggregat 4 stands in front to attract tourists. Peenemunde is developing into a real tourist attraction. And apart from all the interest in rocket technology, is still a place offering unspoiled nature and cultural events. Nevertheless, the remains of the area's military past still dominate. You cannot fail to notice the imposing ruins of the former power station. It was used to supply enormous quantities of power and heat for the research and production of the rockets. The power station went into service on the 1st of November 1942, and 2 turbo generators supplied 30 megawatts of power, using around 150,000 tons of coal annually in the process. The station was finally taken out of service in 1990. Crane facilities built in 1942 stand next to the power stations. Ships lying at anchor in the harbour could unload their cargoes directly. The East German authorities later switched from coal to lignite coal as a fuel. The oxygen production plant required the largest amounts of energy at the time. Time appears to move again in the ruins. From 1942 onwards, 13,000 kilograms of liquid oxygen were produced daily from air by the so-called Linde process. Alcohol and liquid oxygen were required as fuel for the rockets. One start alone used up 8,000 kilograms of oxygen. The oxygen plant was badly damaged during the air raids in 1943, and the Soviets dismantled what was left in 1947. 1 year later, Russian experts attempted to blow the plant up. Today, the wind howls through the broken windows, and nature is slowly taking control of the area. Grass and trees are slowly growing over the ruins of the monument. To locate further traces of Peenemunde's history, we have to take to the air. From here, one can clearly see what is left of a number of test and research areas, blown-up rocket bunkers and observation stands, earth walls and ditches for cables. Cows graze in between all this. There's a marsh biotope where test stand number 7 used to be. Just the same, the original shape and extent of the installations can still be seen. It was here that the Aggregate 4 or V2 rockets were tested. It was from here, a rather featureless place, that the largest rocket in the world blasted off on the 3rd of October 1942 to touch the limits of outer space. A dark shadow still hangs over Peenemunde's past because of the deaths of thousands of prisoners of war, foreign and forced labor, and concentration camp inmates. But one is reminded of the victims here, and Peenemunde wants to be seen as a monument to peace and humanitarian thought. The rockets, apart from the atomic bomb, were the most far-reaching technical achievements of World War II. Peenemunde should stand as a symbol of humanity's aim of dedicating future scientific achievements to civilian and humane aims. Large areas around Peenemunde are still strewn with dangerous old bombs, mines and shells, even though they look so harmless from the air. The public is not allowed to go here, even though curious visitors and local souvenir hunters often try to get in. Peenemunde is and will remain a myth. Even though the military were the motivating forces behind the construction of rockets, it was the men and women, together with Werner von Braun, who made the dream of flying to the moon possible and laid the basis down for manned space travel.